Welcome, everyone. My name is Mike Shelton. I'm a cloud solution architect in the GPS organization, or Global Partner Solutions organization, and my focus is on data and AI and all of the solutions associated with Microsoft offerings in that space. Today, we're going to be focusing on the SQL Server IaaS extension, or the capabilities that we have in Azure around the IaaS extension, specifically for SQL Server and a virtual machine. But as we get started, I wanted to uh, share some information around why the IaaS extension is important and the opportunity for the IaaS extension for really accelerating adoption of SQL Server workloads within Azure. And in order to do that, we want to start by talking about the opportunities for migration. And when you look at the variety of different reasons why customers would migrate to Azure, they could fall into a variety of different categories, if you will. One might be data center contract expiring, where they need to leave the current data center or the current providers that they have, or their existing environments are downsizing and they want to be able to move to the cloud to take advantage of what the cloud has instead of running and managing their own data center. Another example could be the end of software support. As an example, SQL Server 2012 extended support is ending for SQL Server 2012 this July, July 12th specifically. And there's opportunities for customers to move those workloads to Azure to continue to get security patches beyond that extended support date. This is an example of something that we had seen with SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2. So this could be a driver as to why someone would want to move their existing SQL Server workloads running in dedicated hardware virtual machines on premises into Azure. Another reason could be quickly integrating acquisitions or new workloads, new applications that they have, and the ability of standing up that infrastructure in Azure and running their workloads there. Maybe increasing capacity needs or seasonality with their workloads during peak times of business in which they want to expand their capacity into Azure and move virtual machines or move SQL Server workloads into Azure to take advantage of capacity on demand, as an example. Potentially wanting to upgrade or refresh software platform, hardware platform, as an example. These are typically associated with the infrastructure drivers that would have customers move their existing workloads into Azure. There's also app-oriented modernization drivers addressing continued security threats and how can they get a better security posture and leverage additional facilities within Azure to help them provide a better security coverage in their applications. Could be compliance as well as application innovation. But there's a variety of, as you see here, of reasons and drivers for why customers would want to move workloads, specifically in this case, SQL Server workloads to Azure. Now that we see there's potential reasons why they would want to move, the next question is, how do they move? And how do you build a methodology or a framework for helping customers move their existing workloads to Azure? And that's where the Cloud Adoption Framework for Azure comes in. The Cloud Adoption Framework allows us and provides guidance and documentation to help us define a strategy, ensuring we have executive sponsorship, stakeholder alignment in the actual project itself, and then give us the tools and information to start to plan and be ready to do the migration. So from a planning perspective, helping us do discovery and assessment, helping us build the business case and understanding what that total cost of ownership and the ROI of moving to Azure, and building out that migration plan, helping us prioritize workloads, getting those workloads identified, prioritized, and then ready to move into Azure. From a ready perspective, it's really about technical skilling and establishing a landing zone as to how we're going to land these workloads in Azure. And then when we look at adopting, we're talking about then executing on that migration plan that we've built. So you think of that as waves inside of the migration itself, but within the environment of the methodology, we also want to think about once we land our workloads and do the migration into Azure, how are we going to govern those environments, and how are we going to manage that in an ongoing basis? And as we continue our discussion today, we're going to talk specifically about how the SQL Server IaaS extension facilitates not only building the strategy and the plan, but also how does it facilitate and help us from a govern and manage perspective as well. So I've been talking about migrating SQL Server workloads to Azure. I want to just spend a minute and talk about, well, when we say SQL in Azure, what does that really mean? And what I'm talking about here is this idea of Azure SQL and the capabilities that we have with running SQL Server workloads or SQL workloads in Azure have evolved over time. And we have a few options and a variety of choices that really help us determine the best place and the best way of running our SQL Server workloads in Azure. And one we're going to talk about a bit more extensively today, but I'll introduce here now SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. This is great for lift and shift workloads or workloads that require an application that needs access to the operating system itself. So it needs a bit more control over the entire operating system than maybe in other cases. Azure SQL Managed Instance is great for existing applications that we want to modernize. So we want to have the control or span of control, if you will, at an instance level from a SQL Server perspective. And we want to manage it there. And then the components in Azure will manage the other pieces that allow us to then create a reliable and performant environment. And then the other piece is Azure SQL Database, which is best for supporting modern cloud applications where you may have to have just a database scope and stand up those environments leveraging just the database and getting the performance and scalability and reliability from that perspective. So that's going to be our focus for today, primarily the SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines. But when we talk about Azure SQL, there are these different capabilities that allow us to choose the right way of running our SQL workloads in Azure. Now that we've identified the desire or the need to do the migration, we've talked about building a methodology, leveraging the Cloud Adoption Framework. We've seen some of the options that we have when we look at migrating to Azure. What are the different destinations that we can choose from with Azure SQL? Let's talk a little bit about the cloud migration strategies, or what are the different approaches that we might take when we actually do a migration. So one is a rehost. This is often referred to as lift and shift migration. Very commonly a no-code option when we're going to migrate the existing application to Azure. Often it's a very quick, straightforward migration where we're taking the entire application, maybe the virtual machine in both the application and the data platform, and just lifting the entire virtual machine and running that in Azure. Another option we have is this idea of refactoring. And in this case, we're going to perhaps redesign or repackage the different capabilities that we have and leveraging some of the additional services. In this case, maybe Azure SQL Managed Instance as a bit of a PaaS scenario that we can get better use of the management in Azure, a better optimization from a cloud perspective, but not requiring a lot of change in the application itself or the architecture itself. Another approach is re-architecting, where we may modify or extend the application code base to scale or optimize it specifically for the cloud. May again a little bit more intrusive in the changes that we make, and that we're making changes to the application, maybe changes to the code, architecture, the way certain things are designed, really looking at the different features and capabilities that we have available to us to take advantage of something, say Azure SQL Database that we just mentioned in Azure. And then another approach is just rebuild, where you're just going to rebuild the application designed as a cloud native application from the start, and really refactor the entire application, taking advantage of all of the services that the cloud will present to you. But it's important to understand these different migration strategies as we begin to plan out with our customers the approach to migrating SQL Server workloads to Azure, because some will involve more work, more testing, and more time as we look at how do we go about actually doing the migration. And with the different approaches identified, and now we've got some migration strategies, maybe some of the applications we would rehost, some we might refactor or re-architect as an example. We do have tools to help us in this process. And when you look at the different tools that we have through Azure Migrate or the database migration services, these are capabilities or tools from Azure that allow us to help with lift and shift, help us with refactoring or re-architecting our application, helping us with the assessment process so we get a sense of what is inside of the existing application or database. What are the capabilities that will help us move to Azure? What might be scenarios that we have to re-architect or redesign for based on what's being currently used in the application and what might be available in Azure? So there's a variety of tools, there's a variety of guides. You see on the slide here a link to the data migration guide that we have on our website. So this is great resources to help in that migration process and really understanding or identifying the different ways these tools can help, not only from the assessment, but in that planning process and in the migration. Some of these migrations can be offline, some of these migrations can be online, depending on what the scenario is and where the source is coming from, and then the particular destination. So as we can see here from these tools perspective, we can target moving SQL Server workloads to Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, as well as SQL Server running on a virtual machine. Now that we talked about the need for a migration, the various different planning approaches and leveraging the cloud adoption framework, destinations for where we might migrate our workloads, the types of migrations we might follow, and the tools as well. I want to drill in a little bit further on that destination, like which Azure SQL offering is the right destination to move to. Because it's not one size fits all in these scenarios. The best case, I should say, and the ideal scenario is we're able to innovate in our application and we're able to take advantage of the Azure SQL Database offering. It provides us with very robust, scalable, a managed scenario that gives us the most and great options for migrating to Azure. So when you look at what that might present in the database model that you're going to have, are you going to leverage things or need to leverage capabilities such as resource pooling, multi-tenant type of application scenarios? Database size is going to have some considerations. Whether you're using Azure SQL Database general purpose, business critical, or the hyperscale offering have different size and capacity configuration options that you can choose from. So those will be factors in choosing whether or not Azure SQL Database is the right destination. So that's something to factor or to consider as well. Azure SQL Managed Instance as well. If you have applications that are designed to operate at an instance level, maybe multiple databases within the application you need to do cross-database queries, might drive you to choosing Azure SQL Managed Instance. Both of these, the Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance, give you that PaaS or Platform as a Service offering. The benefits there are things like lower administration. The idea of no end of support is that these are continually being upgraded by Microsoft, so you don't have to go through a migration or an upgrade effort as you land on these different platforms. Those are all handled for you. The patching, backup is handled for you as well. There's other things now that you can start to configure as to different levels of high availability with multiple replicas and various different scenarios as that as well. So you have control over various different aspects of the way HA works as an example. But many of the core administrative activities are addressed for you when you look at what a PaaS or Platform as a Service offering can do. Now, we look at then, let's say in order to, whether it's a timeliness or if it's certain features or functions are being leveraged in the SQL Server today, it might be SQL Server 2012, and the time doesn't permit refactoring and re-architecting the application, and you need to do that lift and shift. And SQL Server running as is on a virtual machine is the right destination, right? It could be because of the previous version you need to stay on. You might be leveraging other capabilities of the product of SQL Server, such as reporting services or analysis services. There might be some components of the application overall that require you to have access to the operating system. And these factors will drive you towards wanting to use SQL Server on a virtual machine. Again, you maintain that operating system level control. It's that lift and shift without having to refactor or re-architect the application. And it is a very quick on-ramp into Azure. It can be seen as a stepping stone or as a first step. Customers may migrate to Azure through the lift and shift to the SQL Server on the virtual machine. And in doing so, as a first step, getting the benefits of being in Azure and being in the cloud, and then taking that next step secondarily to then re-architect or rehost that or factor that application to take advantage of the various different PaaS offerings, such as Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance. So let's say at this point, we have determined that SQL Server on a virtual machine is the right destination in our migration as we build out that plan. And we talked about what the Cloud Adoption Framework model gives us from a design and planning perspective. And now we want to talk about how do we take advantage of what Azure has to offer for running SQL Server in a virtual machine. How do we address that governance? How do we address that manageability after we've done that migration? And how do we prepare ourselves for doing a modernization after we've done the migration into a PaaS capability? So that's where the SQL IaaS extension or infrastructure as a service extension comes into play. And what the SQL Server IaaS extension is it provides portal integration for management capabilities for SQL servers running in a virtual machine in Azure. We're going to see much more of what that enables in just a few minutes, but there's really three ways in which the IaaS extension can be configured in a virtual machine for SQL Server. The first one is a lightweight mode. And in this mode, it essentially just copies the binaries. It doesn't actually install the agent, but this gives us license management and limited portal management, but it identifies that virtual machine as a SQL Server. The next mode is the full mode, which gives us full management capabilities with minimal impact on server performance. There is an agent that runs and has that configured, but gives us all of the management capabilities through the Azure portal. Now, this mode previously did require a restart. The lightweight mode did not require a restart. It was very attractive to get started with the IaaS extension. The full mode does not any longer require a restart, but it had in the past. And no agent is an option specific to SQL Server 2008 or SQL Server 2008 R2. And then depending on the operating system in which those are running on, that can be upgraded to the full mode as well. But it allows the identification of those particular virtual machines running SQL Server. Now, one question that we often get is, what does Microsoft do with any data collection or privacy concerns about the fact that we're identifying these as SQL Server virtual machines, and there's extensive documentation that describes Microsoft's approach to data collection and privacy related to the IaaS extension. I put a link in here. You have the slides in the PDF, but this is in the standard documentation for SQL Server IaaS agent extension. But wanted to call that out because it is a common question and is addressed here in the documentation. So let's spend some time looking at how you enable this inside the portal and what would the experience look like for customers that are running the IaaS extension and the benefits that they receive by enabling the IaaS extension. First, what you're seeing here is just we'll see a bit of a few screenshots, and you're seeing a snippet of a screenshot showing the Azure portal, common services that might be consumed by an individual when they're interacting with the Azure portal. The first thing I want to call out, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of Azure SQL, and that's what we see here. If I were to click on this in the portal, what it would do is then give me this screen, which gives me the option of creating an Azure SQL resource. So by clicking create here, then I get this next option in the Azure portal where I can choose either an Azure SQL database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, or SQL Server running on a virtual machine. And that's what we're going to choose here, SQL Server running on a virtual machine. And when you choose that, you'll see a drop down of the various different marketplace images. Now, these are images that have been created in the marketplace that already have SQL Server installed. If you choose one of these images, the IaaS extension agent is already installed. And these images are updated and follow the best practices guidance from Microsoft for deploying SQL Server on a virtual machine. So this is a great way to leverage the creation of a new virtual machine if you're not moving an existing virtual machine that's already been installed or configured, but you're, say, maybe moving the databases only, as an example, depending on your migration methodology that you've identified through the earlier work we discussed. Creating a new virtual machine this way already has the agent installed and does follow the best practices. So we can choose that and create a new virtual machine from there. And when you identify SQL servers running in a virtual machine in Azure, now that's another resource type in Azure. And you see here, again, that similar view where I was seeing before, but now you see a list of resources on the bottom of the page. And the one thing I want to highlight here is one is the virtual machines, there's two lines listing out the resources. The virtual machine is the same name. So these are the same resource in Azure. But when you look at the type, we now have it as a virtual machine, which follows the standard Azure virtual machine configurations, as well as identifying it separately as a SQL virtual machine, which, as we're going to see here in a few minutes, gives us additional management capabilities versus a virtual machine that had SQL Server running on it but wasn't identified in Azure. And that's one of the benefits of enabling the IaaS extension, is allowing Azure in through the portal to see that as a SQL Server virtual machine and giving us that additional management capabilities. And that's what we're going to see next. Now, if we were to go in and choose and have this enabled, we get a variety of benefits. So I'm just going to mention these briefly here, and we'll go into these in more detail. One is portal management. I've been talking to this a bit up to this point, but having that integration in the Azure portal gives us the ability of doing some management activity that we would typically do inside of the SQL Server management tools or inside of the virtual machine itself directly in the portal. So we can do this at scale across multiple virtual machines. We can see this in the Azure portal across multiple virtual machines, and we're going to see some examples of that here just momentarily. But that portal management of SQL Server resources in Azure is one of the key benefits. The other thing, a few other things that we get is the ability of configuring if we choose, and you don't have to enable all of these, but if you choose to leverage these additional capabilities, you can do automatic backups from the portal of your SQL Server databases. You can enable patching automatically to your virtual machines. Provides additional management capabilities for implementing Azure Key Vault integration, allowing you to identify and manage the licensing for that particular virtual machine, as well as the addition. The ability of seeing Defender for cloud integration directly inside of the blade of the SQL Server management view. So we'll see some of that as well. And a fairly recent capability that just went into generally available status is the ability of running the best practices assessments against those virtual machines directly from within the portal there as well. And you can even manage the storage configuration, view disk utilization directly in the portal. So let's drill into these in a little bit more detail. Now, there's a couple of ways in which we can see this additional management functionality in the portal. And the first is, I mentioned that resource type now of a SQL Server Virtual Machine. So if I choose that, I would then launch into the ability of seeing all of the SQL Server Virtual Machines that I have within inside of this particular subscription. So here you see them listed as the name, the resource group that they're in, the license type that they are, as well as the particular version that's deployed on. So these are both that you see here, 2 virtual machines. They're running on SQL Server 2019 on the Windows Server 2022. You can see the edition that they are. So this is Developer Edition, as well as seeing the location of them. So all of the SQL Server virtual machines would be displayed in this view. So this is a great resource to, one, catalog and identify not only the virtual machines that are there, where they're located as far as resource group and physical region location within Azure, but as well as the license type. So this is a great opportunity for you to help customers to understand their cost optimization. Are they leveraging their Azure hybrid use benefits and leveraging their existing investment in SQL Server properly and effectively? Are they leveraging PayGo where they have intermittent workloads, or the appropriate workload where that is the right cost model? You can also look at it based on addition to help them understand, are they fully leveraging and maximizing the addition capabilities that they have with SQL Server, as well as opportunities for upgrade and or potentially migration to PaaS services from what they have deployed in Azure. Maybe it's the version, if they're running older versions, opportunities to help them upgrade to take advantage of newer features and capabilities. SQL Server 2022 has been announced in public preview at Build and is now something that we can start working with customers to see those benefits and how they can take advantage of new capabilities there. So this inventory helps us identify the resources that customers are using for a variety of reasons, for, as I mentioned, cost optimization, upgrade opportunities, modernization opportunities to PaaS. So it's a great way to be able to see those resources that we can work with. Now, the other thing that you can do from this view is you can enable, so I mentioned if you build a virtual machine from the marketplace that already has the agent installed, if you migrate existing virtual machines to Azure and they don't have the agent installed, one thing you can do is you can install them individually through script, through PowerShell or Azure CLI. You can do it in bulk through PowerShell or Azure CLI. Or one thing you can do is you can select this option here in the portal, this button right here, Automatic SQL Server VM Registration. And by enabling this, what this will do is any new virtual machine that is migrated into this subscription will automatically get the agent installed. So it's an easy way if you're going through a migration effort with a customer to have the agent enabled once that is migrated over to the subscription here. So I wanted to call that out. So this is one way you can look at it from that SQL Server, choosing that SQL virtual machines as a resource type in Azure. Another way that we can access that, again, the details of that virtual machine, just click on the virtual machine in the list, and then that would bring you to those additional management capabilities of the Azure portal for that particular virtual machine. So that's one way of getting to those details for managing and configuring SQL Server Virtual Machine capabilities, part of the IaaS extension. Another way that you can do it is from the virtual machine blade itself. These are what you're seeing on the screen here is an image of the various different configuration options for a virtual machine, independent of whether it's running SQL Server or not. But with the SQL Server IaaS extension, you have this option here in that blade in which you can then choose to manage the SQL Server configuration options. When you choose that, you'll be prompted here to launch into that view that we had just seen previously. So for that particular virtual machine that I'm focused on, choosing the SQL Server configuration, clicking the Manage SQL Server Virtual Machine, then brings me to that same place as where I was before. So now I want to spend a few minutes talking through some of the details of the additional management capabilities that you get for running the IaaS extension with that integration in Azure. And the first one that I'd like to speak about is the ability of managing the license metadata. So you'll see here I can choose whether it's pay as you go. I can choose Azure Hybrid Benefits, and if I choose Azure Hybrid Benefits, there's some additional properties I would fill in, verifying that I have an actual license that I can apply towards the Azure, the AHub benefits, and configure it that way. And then I can also enable whether this is an HADR implementation. So there's had been some licensing modifications some time ago that enables additional benefits for HADR running SQL Server in Azure. So you're identifying to Azure what type of license mode, which will impact then the costing and billing of that particular virtual machine based on the selection here. So you can choose that configuration with the IaaS extension enabled. The other thing that you can do is you can then choose the addition. And again, this is a metadata operation where we're identifying in that inventory what is the addition that we have here. It doesn't actually, this in the portal, it doesn't actually change the addition running in the virtual machine. If you wanted to say go from standard edition to enterprise edition, you would do an in-place edition upgrade. And then once you did that, you identify that in the portal as now it's enterprise, what have you. But you can change that configuration here in the inventory of virtual machines you have. You would then see the appropriate and correct edition applied to that virtual machine. Now, another area that you would see, which is a tremendous benefit as well, is storage management. From the overview display, you can see the details of how much drive space is being consumed from the various different drives that you have attached to that virtual machine. So here we see we've got SQL Server data being represented. We have log data being represented, as well as other data that we have inside of the virtual machine. So we can see availability, we can see what's being consumed. So this is great because if I'm starting to exceed storage capacity and I need to increase that, I can see that without having to actually go into the virtual machine itself in order to do that identification. So right from here, I can see how much drive space is being consumed and if I need to grow those drives over time. So I could do all that from within inside the portal here. And then with inside the portal, what you're seeing here is the storage configuration option. And we have 3 different drives. Here I see the data, the log, and the tempdb. And I can go in and configure those right here in the portal. So as an example, I'll take a look at the data drive. And here, what I'm going to do is it's giving me the option of extending the disk. So let's say I start running out of drive space. I'd like to extend that particular data drive so I can add disk to that drive. And in this case, the disk is a, you can't see it completely in the view here. It's a terabyte size premium P30. The disk size it's giving you there, and it's giving you the max IOPS and the max throughput, which is important. And if you look at that warning, it's telling me that adding capacity of higher volume data reads may not benefit based on the virtual machine that I have. And we're not going to go through the details. There's a tremendous amount of resources that have been provided, videos and such on the different configurations for choosing the right virtual machine and the right disk configuration to maximize IOPS, maximize throughput. It's a critical factor when you're designing your SQL Server virtual machines for Azure. Many of the performance potential challenges have been seen for mismatched IOPS based on what the actual workload is that's running on the SQL Server Virtual Machine. That goes back to the planning and designing your migration methodology and doing the assessments, understanding the workload that you have running in SQL Server today, and ensuring that we have the proper mapping from a configuration perspective, from that performance alignment going forward in SQL Server and the virtual machine. This helps tremendously because now we can see what the max IOPS for that particular configuration is, the max throughput, and one, making sure that it matches the virtual machine. And various different virtual machines will have maximum IOPS and throughput as well, various different levels of caching that can be applied. And there's some great documentation that really discuss what's the right combination of disks and the right combination of virtual machine selection based on workload, the tooling as well from an assessment perspective. I talked about the database migration service. We'll make recommendations based on the current workload that you have as to what the target should be. But this gives us that view right in the portal to be able to select that. So as an example, I can choose then the list and see what are the different drives that I can choose from, not only the size, but it gives me the drive configuration. So that affects the max IOPS and the max throughput. And then in the next view, you see here with OneDrive, my max IOPS is 5,000, my max throughput is 200. If I were to change that, let's say to 2 drives, now I can see that my max IOPS is now 10,000 and max throughput's 400. So this helps when you look at trying to achieve the max throughput and the max IOPS based on getting larger, smaller drives and more drives in quantity and matching that to the virtual machine that you have selected and helping through that process. So it's great to be able to do that extension of drive space and adding disks to the VM configuration directly in the portal. TempDB, the best practices is on the local SSD for the virtual machine, helps you lay out the number of files that are associated with the TempDB that by the best practice map to the number of cores that you have in the virtual machine. And this interface helps you map through and achieve that. So a great way of ensuring that you're maximizing your performance when it comes to that drive and your storage management. So this is a key enabler that we have with the IaaS extension to be able to do this through the portal. Now, another area that we have is the ability of configuring automated backups. As I mentioned earlier, you could still do backups through leveraging SQL Agent. You can do backup to URL and backup to, blob storage in Azure. You can back up to local disks and then copy those backups if you have some sort of archiving approach. But if you want a direct way of doing it via the portal, so all of those ways are inside of the virtual machine, leveraging Management Studio to connect to them, managing them as you may have previously. During leveraging this, you can do it through the portal, various different configuration options. And again, these capabilities continue to grow and improve over time. As an example, some of the improvements with automated backup is the retention period of time is increased. So now you can go up to 90 days. As an example, in this view, you can configure the storage count where you would like the backups to be stored. You can put them in a container in a storage account and enabling various different backup configuration schedules and so on. So all of that can be done from the portal here as well. And then next in the patching scenario, we have in this case the ability of enabling automatic patching and then defining the schedule for that particular patching. I will say that the patching in this case are for in what's marked as important updates. So this isn't updating service packs or cumulative updates or what have you. These are going to be more of your critical updates and so on that we do from an automatic patching perspective. Additional patching, version upgrades, as an example, would be things that the customer administrative teams or additional support teams will be responsible for. And that is a benefit of moving to a PaaS offering such as Azure SQL Database or Azure SQL Managed Instance, in that those are always being upgraded and always kept current, so you don't have to worry about that upgrade scenario. So critical patches, or what's as identified here is marked as important, patches can be applied automatically if you enable that. Otherwise, any other upgrades or patching was done separately. But this is a nice feature to make sure you're getting in an automated fashion any important patches or updates to that virtual machine. And then some additional security configurations. You have the ability of turning on, if you so needed, SQL credentials, which is disabled as you see here, or Key Vault integration, managing it right from within that virtual machine configuration. You have the ability of tying that in and being able to leverage Azure Key Vault for integration within the Azure SQL virtual machine here, as well as Defender for Cloud integration directly into Portal. So you could enable Defender for Cloud for SQL Server in the virtual machine and see that in a separate location in Azure. But if you don't have access to that, or if you're only concerned, if you're a DBA only concerned with these virtual machines and you want to be able to see any security faults, audits, recommendations directly in that virtual machine, that's integrated via the IaaS extension into this SQL Server Management blade here as well, and you'll be able to see that directly on that per VM basis. So that gives you a nice capability of managing your security while it's front and center without having to navigate separately for that. And another area that's recent addition to the IaaS extension is the ability of enabling, and that's what you're seeing here, the enablement capability for the SQL Server Best Practices Assessment. So this follows the standard SQL Server Best Practices API that can be enabled through Data Studio or Management Studio or directly through the API to assess a SQL Server instance to see if it's following best practices guidelines, which are all documented. And in this case, you enable the best practices assessment and a schedule for that. And the results will go to a Log Analytics workspace, and then there are workbooks in Log Analytics that you can then go and view the results of the assessments and identify if your particular SQL Server instances are following those best practices that are identified. So it's a great addition without having to run that separately, tying all into Azure, leveraging Log Analytics of Azure to store that information, and then directly in the Azure portal being able to identify and review the best practices findings and assessments from that API. So that's built in, and again, that's recently gone into GA or general availability. So these are, again, many of the capabilities you have, the benefits of running the SQL IaaS extension with SQL Server running in a virtual machine. Finally, I just wanted to highlight that there are some PowerShell commands that you can leverage in this case, or some Azure CLI, as I mentioned earlier, for registering either a single virtual machine or virtual machines in bulk. In this case, this is a PowerShell commandlet that you can run. You give it the name of the virtual machine, the resource group that it's in, and then you're returning the management type. So this will tell you whether or not it's in lightweight mode, full mode, or what have you. So there are some additional commands that you can leverage from there in order to either script or automate various different capabilities that are provided by the IaaS extension. So in conclusion, migration to Azure is a critical workload that we embark upon to help our customers take advantage of leveraging SQL Server in Azure. There's a variety of steps to go through that process. One is assessing what is currently in place, preparing a migration and helping to move that workload into Azure and determining what is the right destination as far as that SQL workload, optimizing that workload once you migrate to Azure, and then securing and managing that workload. We haven't talked in detail as it relates to the PaaS offerings, but many of those capabilities that we've discussed here, from the optimization, securing and managing, are addressed through features, functions, and capabilities through Azure SQL Database and Azure SQL Managed Instance. Specifically, as it relates to Azure SQL Server in a virtual machine, the IaaS extension assists us in each of these different scenarios, whether it's getting an inventory of virtual machines that we have in Azure to help us assess what is there and prepare that migration or modernization to PaaS offerings. And then once we have, or if we're going to remain in running in a virtual machine, helping us optimize that environment, whether it's from a cost perspective or storage configuration or what have you, as well as securing and managing it through backups, through patching, through integration with Defender for cloud or Azure Key Vault. The IaaS extension gives us those additional benefits that allow us to really ensure that we're getting the best experience of running SQL Server in Azure, whether it's in platform as a service or infrastructure as a service capability. So provided, and you'll have these in the slides, some additional resources for additional learning and capabilities, whether it's the migration guides, the modernization center, and so on. With that, open it up for questions if there's any questions from the audience, and just thank everyone for attending today and look forward to engaging and helping as it relates to moving SQL Server workloads to Azure.
Hey, Mike, great presentation. Thank you very much. And for everybody in the recording or in the webcast, I'm Brian. I'm a colleague of Mike. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them into the chat. A couple that I've got for you right now. You mentioned you had an example of PowerShell scripting. I wanted to confirm. I think you mentioned that you can also use the CLI and Bash, right, to do everything in addition to PowerShell. Is that accurate?
So it's accurate to a degree, in the sense that certain functionality is available in both PowerShell and the Azure CLI or Bash. There are some functionality that's only PowerShell. So depending on what you're doing, there may be one or the other choice that you would make. Everything is in PowerShell, but like registration, these sorts of options are in both, but some of the information gathering was in PowerShell.
Gotcha. Okay, and kind of along the same lines of CLI and Bash, how about running the SQL Server IaaS extensions on Linux VMs? Is that available? Are there any major differences? What does that look like?
That's a great question, Brian. I focused our discussion today on the Windows platform, but yes, you can run the IaaS extension for SQL Server running in a virtual machine on Linux. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Final question is, I believe when the IaaS extensions were first released, you had to do a full restart of the SQL Server. Is that still true, or has that been changed?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. When the IaaS extension was first released, only the full mode required a restart of the virtual machine, but as of last September, it no longer requires a restart, even transitioning to the full mode as well. So you can move to the full mode without having to do a restart of the virtual machine currently. Previously, that was the case, and it's something that had been known before the recent changes.
Gotcha. All right. Well, thanks. And one additional question is, what about any IaaS extensions for managing reporting services? I don't know if we dive specifically into any of the other types of SQL Server installations, but one of our attendees had a questions around SSRS.
Yeah, so the IaaS extension would be applicable to running, if it's running the SQL Server more in the engine. If you only had SSRS on the machine, the additional capabilities you would have wouldn't relate because it's running differently. But if you had, say, the catalog database, there, you could install the extension there. So there's no specific management functionality for reporting services or analysis services or SSIS outside of what identifying it as a SQL Server machine and then applying it to the engine itself.
That makes sense. So if you have a split deployment where the database engine is somewhere else, perhaps on either a different machine or whatever the scenario might be, but you're running the say the website or any other functionality, it really only applies to the machine with the actual SQL Server engine on it.
That's right.
Okay.
Right. Great question, though, and at least that's the current functionality today. There are separately, if from a migration perspective, discussions we can have as far as what does it look like to migrate SSRS to, say, Power BI, and how might that be facilitated, and is that a right direction, and or analysis services migration to Power BI as well, or Azure analysis services. But if you're using, say, the multidimensional engine, which would require you to be on a virtual machine, again, identifying it as a SQL Server from the engine perspective, but not additional administration capabilities for SSAS in that case specifically, right? Great question, though. Great question.
Thank you. I think that's it for the questions, so we can wrap up.
Great. Well, again, thank you everyone for your time and attendance. Great session and having you with us today, and look forward to any future sessions that we can have. Please let us know. And just as a quick reminder, it was posted already, but if you could complete the survey, and certainly in the survey gives us the opportunity or gives you the opportunity, excuse me, to place any additional thoughts for future sessions or content that you'd like to see. So if you'd like to dig into more detail, say just on the best practices assessment, we can drill into all of that, or more about migration of reporting services or analysis services and scenarios along those lines. Happy to get into those details, but appreciate you filling out the survey and your time today. Thank you all very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Mike. Take care, everybody.